Hey guys, Buildzoid here, and today we're going to be doing another oscilloscope video, this time on the MSI Z690 Unify X with the 13900K because of this comment. Yeah, so that's what we're going to be doing today. Anyway, because this board has, actually I guess we'll just take a look at it. So, on this board you have a setting called CPU core voltage monitor. I don't really know why it exists because both VCC Sense and Socket Sense are not DieSense, which I guess explains why it's called VCC Sense and not DieSense. But either way, neither of these is actually particularly accurate, so not really sure why MSI bothered with implementing them. Like Socket Sense is the usual configuration, and VCC Sense is I don't know what that is. But anyway, these not only change the core voltage readout that you get from the Super I/O on the motherboard, they also change how the LLC settings behave. So on Socket Sense, 1.42 volts with mode 6 LLC is roughly equivalent to mode 7 on VCC Sense, which basically means that this motherboard effectively has like 16 different LLC settings, which is too many LLC settings. So we're not actually going to go through all of them, and we're going to do this video a bit differently, and maybe I'll prefer this methodology and we'll use this going forward for all oscilloscope videos. I will show you the LLC settings that actually work well, and then, yeah, we're going to like skip all the ones that don't actually make any sense. Like mode 2 is useless, mode 3 is useless, mode 4 is also, well, actually, we're going to take a look at mode 4 on Socket Sense, but like on VCC Sense, useless. So there's a bunch of LLC, and we're going to take a look at mode 1 just to sort of show what happens if you have no V-droop whatsoever. But anyway, we're going to start out with 1.42 volts mode 6, which is basically optimal. There's no measurable undershoot, yeah, that's kind of that. So now we're going to save and reset. And also I'm going to show like mode 7 and mode 8 have some rather strange behavior under load. So yeah, we're going to start with like a good LLC setting, and then we're going to look at the other LLC settings that aren't as good. That way, hopefully we can save some time. Anyway, if you're new to these oscilloscope videos, the idea is very simple. I want this voltage right here, highlighted in yellow, to be as close to this voltage right here as possible when the system is running Y-Cruncher small FFTs. So the Y-Cruncher configuration that I'm using here is this, right? So all this does is it runs like 10,000 seconds of the FFT test with a 50 megabyte memory size, which basically fits into the L3 cache of the CPU and consequently pulls a lot of power and just is a nice static load, because the FFT algorithm is very, like, it's a very static load. Like, there's not a lot of transients to it directly itself, and we're mostly looking at the transients caused by the actual operating system rather than the workload. Because actually, under most circumstances, the operating system is the bigger cause of transients than really anything that you'd be ever running. Anyway, so let's start running Y-Cruncher. So that's Y-Cruncher running, and as you can see, the load is very constant, right? The core voltage is mostly staying like pretty flat over here. So like we're not seeing the voltage go up and down because the load is pretty is constant basically. I guess I should have shown you a more dynamic load. So we're just going to run the Y-Cruncher benchmark for that, which is very dynamic. So you can see how the voltage basically moves around based on how much work the CPU is basically doing. This is a lot. Oh, I guess the memory settings right now are terrible, so it's pretty memory bottlenecked. But yeah, you can kind of see how there's like, actually there's not really load spikes in this because the memory is so slow right now. But yeah, which the FFT algorithm really isn't memory bound, so it's a nice heavy constant load, but. Yeah. Anyway, with this motherboard, you do have VR VOUT voltage sensing available in hardware info. And so if you're basically wanting to check your actual CPU core voltage, this is the sensor you want to be looking at because that's the most accurate one. That's directly from the from the VRM controller itself. So anyway, now that we have Y-Cruncher running, I'm just going to reset the sensors. And if I'm not moving the mouse around, we have a minimum voltage of 1.23-ish volts and an average voltage of 1.5-ish volts. So about a 20 millivolt gap between the two, and that's a very good result. And if I start moving the mouse around, we get slightly lower minimums, but it's not a huge difference. So that is a good result. That's what we want to see. And the reason why moving the mouse around causes the minimum voltage to actually come down is because, actually I'm going to single, and then, oh right, we're going to pull the trigger down, ta-da. So these spikes that we're seeing here are actually the operating system interrupting the workload and basically doing stuff. And if I start moving the mouse around, then obviously the operating system is processing the mouse input, and that is even worse than just like the operating system doing its own thing. Because like these very regularly spaced spikes that we see, these are actually just like the Windows event timer, which is how Windows makes sure that everything is running correctly. If you're watching a video or something, these spikes actually get significantly closer together. Normally they're spaced by, I think, 16.25 milliseconds, which is a really random frequency. And then if you're watching like a video or something, like if for some reason the operating system needs to be like responsive, it goes up to one event timer tick every millisecond. So instead of seeing like 3 of them, here we would see a lot more of them. Anyway, I'm not gonna actually show that, but that's just how Windows works. And if I start moving the mouse around, then obviously moving the mouse like interrupts the Y-Cruncher workload, and that causes a big nasty transient that we can hopefully capture. Because usually what we're seeing is that, like, Y-Cruncher is happily running, and then it gets interrupted by Windows. The voltage jumps up because there's a load release of there's a lot of current flowing, and then suddenly there's very little current flowing, and then it ramps back up, and the voltage comes down. Like, the current draw ramps back up again, and the voltage comes down. Now, if we do this with me moving the mouse around, actually, it's not going to be super obvious. Yeah, and if I'm moving the mouse around, you can see that, like, processing the mouse input basically interrupts Y-Cruncher for longer. So anyway, we don't really see a lot of significant undershoot in this scenario because the LLC is actually set correctly. So yeah, mode 6 with socket sense is pretty much optimal. Now we're just going to stop that, and we're going to go to mode 5. And that was like 1.228 minimums. Mode 5 on socket sense is also relatively viable. It has a bit more undershoot on it, but it's not like completely terrible. And obviously the goal with all of these voltage comparisons is that the average voltage under load is the same. So the VR VOUT voltage reading is also the same. So like right now we were aiming for, so I was aiming for like 1.2 volts VR VOUT. It was a little bit higher than that. It was like 1.205. But anyway, next we're going to go 1.38 volts with mode 5, which we're going to see a little bit more undershoot, but still pretty good voltage regulation overall. And we're also going to have the same VR VOUT voltage. Also, I should point out that the oscilloscope is currently hooked up to the back of the motherboard, so we're not getting, we're not seeing this voltage as the silicon of the CPU itself is seeing it, because there's the impedance of the CPU socket between my measuring location on the back of the board and the silicon of the CPU. Which is just a limitation of me not wanting to abuse a CPU so I can get the probe closer to the silicon. Anyway, so we're going to open up hardware info again, and I'm actually just going to start Y-Cruncher immediately. There we go. So Again, our average voltage is around 1.25 volts, right? Because I did pre-testing, so I already know what set voltage for each LLC is necessary to get the same load voltage. So yeah, we're at about 1.253. And if I'm not touching the mouse, the voltage regulation looks really good. If I do move the mouse around, we see a bit more undershoot, right? Previously, we were seeing like 1.228 volts. Now we're seeing more like 1.221 volts, so about 7 millivolts more undershoot. Now, it is worth noting that in theory, the undershoot at the CPU end should be actually worse than what we're seeing on the oscilloscope, because the oscilloscope is hooked up to the back of the motherboard, and the undershoot is worst at the CPU. The voltage overshoot is worst at the output of the VRM. So we're sort of seeing more voltage overshoot on the, well, we're not actually seeing any overshoot right now because the LLC is set like reasonably. But if we had like a mode 1 LLC, we'd be seeing a lot of overshoot, which would potentially be actually worse than what the CPU itself is seeing, because we're on the motherboard side where the overshoot sort of comes from the excess energy stored in the inductor, in the inductors on the motherboard, whereas the undershoot basically comes from the fact that the CPU suddenly drops, like requires a lot more energy than what is available at that moment. So you get a voltage drop, which we call undershoot. Anyway, we're going to scroll down to the VR VOUT sensor. And as you can see, it's not quite 1.2 volts, but close enough, right? 1.2-ish volts again. And yeah, so it floats around a bit. Unfortunately, the resolution of well, voltage, like any kind of voltage measurement, is not going to be perfect. So it's going to be a little bit of a difference between different measurements. Also, it looks like as the motherboard warms up, the undershoot gets worse. So yeah, now we're seeing like 1.213 volts. So about 15 millivolts more undershoot than with mode 6 LLC, but still, you know, not unusable amounts of undershoot. But I think you'd, like, unless you're desperately trying to keep your idle voltage down, this is still like mode 6 is the better LLC to use. And considering how hot 13th gen CPUs run, I don't really see a reason to not use mode 6, because yeah, your load voltage, like we're getting like we're still getting a pretty high load voltage with the LLC settings that I'm using right now. Anyway, so now we're going to go to an LLC setting that's actually not ideal. So we're going to go to we're just going to go straight to mode 1. Screw it. Right, like we've looked at like what good and relatively good voltage regulation looks like. Now let's take a look at what it looks like when the voltage regulation is absolutely atrocious. So with mode 1 LLC, there's no V droop whatsoever. And we'll see that on the VR VOUT sensor. It will stay at a flat 1.2 volts. On the oscilloscope, we're actually going to see the voltage go up because of the CPU socket impedance. So yeah, that's just kind of what happens. But yeah, already, like, we aren't even running Y-Cruncher, and you can already see that our minimum voltages are lower than they were before, which is bad. Right? Like, at idle, it's not really going to affect stability, because at idle, the CPU isn't working very hard, but once we actually run Y-Cruncher, actually, I think our minimums are going to end up being even worse than they are at idle. So yeah, is going to be bad. So anyway, if I scroll down to the VR VOUT sensor again, which is over here. So yeah, right now we're at idle and it's sitting at 1.2 volts. Right. And if I start Y-Cruncher, which is here, our VR VOUT sensor is still at a nice flat 1.2 volts. The only issue is, our oscilloscope voltage readings right now are 1.25 average, which is, again, similar to the 1.253, 1.252 that we had with mode 5 and mode 6. So the average voltage that the CPU is receiving is the same. And so the power consumption is the same. And the heat output of the CPU is the same. However, if I start moving the mouse around, our minimums are hitting 1.14. So our actual, like, overclocking stability of the system right now is basically, like, it's like we're feeding the CPU 1.14 volts, but with the power consumption of 1.2, right? Whereas on mode 6 and mode 5, we were getting minimums of like 1.22, 1.23, and so we were getting the sort of overclocking capabilities of 1.22 volts, 1.23 volts, but with the power consumption, well, not like with the same power consumption as we have right now. Again, there's the whole issue that the voltages we measure on the back of the motherboard are at different levels than what the CPU is actually getting because of the impedance. So, yeah, of course, if I don't move the mouse, the voltage regulation actually looks relatively okay. But, yeah, this is not good. Also, right now, the upward spikes, like previously, the upward spikes that we were seeing on the oscilloscope, these wouldn't, like previously, this wouldn't have been considered overshoot because our set voltage was like 1.42 volts, and we were, like mode 6, we were at 1.42 volts. So basically, as long as the voltage is below 1.42 volts, we're not overshooting our target voltage, right? Because our target voltage is 1.42 volts minus some V-droop based on the LLC. And the amount of V-droop we get is proportional to the current that the VRM is outputting. So that wasn't overshoot, right? But now, because we're targeting a voltage of 1.2 volts, yeah, this right here, this is just straight overshoot. Because this is just like a 1.34 volts instead of the 1.2 that we punched in. However, it's not actually a concern, right? Like this isn't, this looks ugly, but it doesn't actually really concern us. The bigger issue is the undershoot, which does negatively impact stability when overclocking. So, yeah, anyway, let's actually take a closer look at one of these undershoots now that we're on an LLC where it'll actually be properly visible. So I'm going to put the oscilloscope, actually I'm going to put the trigger below our voltage. I'm going to put it to single, I'm going to zoom in a bit, and then I'm just going to move the mouse. And yeah, we get this. Basically what we're seeing here is, you know, Y-Cruncher is happily running, then it gets interrupted, so the voltage goes up, then Windows does stuff. And while it's doing stuff, eventually we get these like massive downward spikes every so often. And then Y-Cruncher like starts running again over here. And basically during these big downward spikes, the CPU would crash if it was right on the edge of stability. I might do like I've done a video demonstrating that like a couple years ago with I think an 8700K. I could redo that demonstration with one of the newer CPUs, but don't see much reason to. Yeah, anyway, so Mode 1 LLC is bad, which really doesn't take a genius to figure that out. You disable the V-droop, you get, well, the overshoot isn't really a concern, but the undershoot, it does negatively affect stability. So the undershoot is just bad. There's nothing really else to add to that. It's just undershoot is bad for overclocking. You don't want it. So the next thing we're going to take a look at is Mode 7 LLC, which behaves very strangely. And Mode 8 also does this on actually both socket sense and VCC sense. So for Mode 7, we're going to go to 1.46 volts. And we're on socket sense, and now we're going to go to Mode 7. So like this board really does have like an optimal LLC setting in like Mode 5, Mode 6 for socket sense. Whereas like some other, like there's a lot of other motherboards where you can just keep adding more and more V-droop and the voltage regulation, like it doesn't get worse. It doesn't improve, but it doesn't get worse. Whereas this board, it's not that it gets worse. Like we were not going to see more undershoot, but we're going to see some very weird voltage behavior that is like not desirable at Mode 7. Because so far, right, when we run Y-Cruncher, the actual average voltage is pretty much constant, right? The main body of the voltage line doesn't really move much. But yeah, on Mode 7 and Mode 8, we start seeing something rather strange. And I'm not even going to bother bringing up... Actually, we should bring up hardware info for this. Also, I'm going to have to... It helps with hardware info load if you don't have Y-Cruncher running at the same time, so... There we go. Okay. So, and you can already kind of see it. Like there's like weird blockiness to the voltage waveform, but yeah, so I'm not touching the mouse, right? We get our 1.2 volts VR VOUT. So, but you can kind of see that it's like moving kind of up and down a bit. And on the oscilloscope, you can really see that, like, I'm going to pull the trigger in. Oh, wait, that's not the trigger. What did I... Oh, that's the horizontal. Oops. There we go. I'm going to try... Yeah, so you can kind of see how, like, we have, like, a constant level, and then it comes up a bit, and then it goes down a bit, and then here it comes up a bit, and it's just, like, it's not supposed to be doing that. Right? Like, it wasn't doing that on mode 1, it wasn't doing that on mode 5, it wasn't doing that on mode 6, and then you get to mode 7, and it starts doing this. So, yeah, this is not supposed to be happening, yeah, that's the main reason not to use mode 7. Also, our voltage regulation doesn't actually improve, arguably because of this, like, weird bouncing voltage behavior, but also there's just not much undershoot at this point. Anyway, so yeah, mode 7 is not advisable for this motherboard, and mode 8 is never advisable, because actually mode 7 on VCC Sense is actually good. On Socket Sense, it does that weird stuff. So, yeah, so now we're going to switch over to VCC Sense, which doesn't affect the VR VOUT sensor, it just affects the like super IO voltage sensor. So, anyway, now we're going to switch to VCC Sense, and the thing with VCC Sense, your LLC steps are a lot worse. So, like, we're going to go to 1. So, on Socket Sense, going from mode 6 to mode 5, we went from 1.42 volts to 1.38 volts, and we saw, like, a 10 millivolt, 15 millivolt, you know, like, worsening of undershoot by doing that. On VCC Sense, the difference between mode 7 and mode 6 is 1.415 volts versus 1.335. So there's like a huge gap between mode 6 and mode 7 on VCC Sense. And yeah, mode 6 on VCC Sense is awful. It performs like mode 4 on Socket Sense, basically. And I'll show you that. We will take a look at that. So yeah, it's very, very weird that MSI's LLC settings behave like this. Or, well, actually, so, no, it is weird, but this is a thing that's been, like, with MSI. Like, ever since they introduced the VCC Sense Socket Sense thing, this has been a thing with their LLC settings, is that they have, like, different slopes based on which sensing mode you're using, which, I really don't want to know why that's happening, because it shouldn't, but here we are. Oh, well, maybe it's just some actual, like, intentionally programmed behavior, which would be the best case scenario. If it's a result of how they're connecting the super IO to the core voltage, then that is bad. But anyway, so yeah, our VR VOUT again is around 1.2 volts, right? So, yep. You can also see that we don't have that weird bouncing of the waveform isn't, like, shifting up and down a bit anymore, because that only happens when you have, like, mode 7 or mode 8 LLC on, well, mode 7 on Socket Sense or mode 8 on VCC Sense. Yeah, anyway, so I'm going to reset the sensors, and we're just going to move the mouse around, get some transients going, and we can see that the voltage regulation right now is very similar to what it is with mode 6 on Socket Sense, where we're averaging about 1.25 volts, 1.254 right now, and our undershoot is about 1.226, whereas previously it was like 1.228. So margin of error as far as I'm concerned, right? Anyway, so yeah, mode 7 on VCC Sense is good. And honestly, because the terminology on this motherboard is a mess, I'm probably going to put a summary into the description at this point, because I keep screwing up with which mode. Like, I'm having trouble keeping track of which mode is good and bad. And I have notes. which is how I know what voltages to set for everything. So anyway, that was VCC Sense mode 7, and now we're going to try mode 6, which is going to be awful. And then we're also going to take a look at mode 1, which is also going to be really awful, because mode 1 always sucks. Like, you should just not use mode 1, ever. No, that's not true. Mode 1 has its usefulness. It's really good for thermal testing, right? Because you don't, like, so with no V-droop, because with CPUs, as their operating temperature goes up and down, the amount of current they pull slightly changes, and so their operating voltage will actually slightly change if you have a very droopy LLC based on what temperature the CPU is at, even if it's running the same workload. So if you're doing like thermal testing, it's really annoying because your LLC is going to be like changing the voltage that the CPU is receiving. However, if you have no V-droop, the voltage will never change on average. The average voltage will never change. The minimums and maximums are going to be way worse, but the average voltage is going to be constant. So anyway, mode 6 with VCC Sense and 1.335 volts. This should give us an average voltage of 1.25 volts, and I'm going to say we're going to be seeing undershoot below 1.2 volts. So, you know, like more than 50 millivolts worth of undershoot instead of the roughly 30-ish that we've been seeing, like 20 to 30-ish that we've been seeing with like the good LLC settings, like mode 6 with socket sense, or mode 5 with socket sense, or mode 7 with VCC sense. Yeah, because we really don't want to be seeing less than 1.2 volt minimums if our average voltage is 1.25. Especially also when you consider that the actual like voltage at the CPU itself, right? The VR VOUT sensor is reading 1.2 volts, and if on the back of the socket we're seeing less than 1.2 volts, then the CPU must be getting probably even less than that. So yeah, that is definitely not ideal. So let's pull up hardware info again, just to show the VR VOUT voltage. And let's hit Y Cruncher. Yeah, so VR VOUT is, again, around 1.2 volts, right? And our average voltage on the oscilloscope is around 1.25. And if I don't touch the mouse, things look pretty good. And then I do touch the mouse, and things look not so good. It's actually not as bad as I thought it would be. We're still getting like we're still above 1.2 volts. So, hey, not a complete disaster. Yeah, okay, so it could have been worse. But yeah, this is already like, this is not great. Right, like now we're looking at it looks like the hardware info window is making Windows very upset about something. But yeah, so I mean, we're still managing to stay above 1.2 volts, so you know, that's not too bad, but definitely not as good as mode 7, and not as good as the socket sense mode 5 or mode 6. So anyway, now we're gonna restart, and I need to close that. And we're gonna hit mode 1. But I don't get why MSI bothers with having, like, there is some utility to have an like V-droop off option, but I don't understand why there's like such a big gap between mode 6 and mode 7. Mode 5 is like 1.26 volts to get the same average voltage. And then you have like mode 4, 3, and 2, which are like 15 millivolts apart. Because like mode 3 is 1.23 volts. To get the same load voltage as mode 6, or mode 5, right? And mode 5 is 1.26, so there's like a 30 millivolt gap between them, which is like, you got it. Like, well, so mode 3 arguably might still have some utility in some scenarios, but mode 2 and mode 4 is like, why do we need so much granularity in the LLC settings? Anyway, let's go. Actually, yeah, well, okay, no, do I want to use, let's try mode 6. I mean mode 5 with 1.26 volts. Mind you, mode 6 on VCC Sense is roughly the same as mode 4 on Socket Sense. So, yeah, anyway, mode 5, and then we're going to do mode 1. Oh, this video is going to end up being 40 minutes long again, isn't it? Why do I keep doing this? It's just like, we could have just gone to mode 1 and ended the video. It would have been great. It's not like we're just gonna see more undershoot. Imagine that. Reducing the V droop adds undershoot. Also, at this point, we're starting to actually see some overshoot, right? Our maximum voltage is now above our... Well, okay, it's not that much above our average voltage. At idle, at least. So let's get hardware info going. And here goes Y-Cruncher. And our average voltage is, 1.25-ish volts, 1.252. And if I move them out, well, actually, we are getting significant overshoot, right? Like 1.3 plus volts at this point. So well above the 1.26 set voltage. Our minimums are, I mean, if I don't touch the mouse, everything looks pretty good. And then I do touch the mouse. And we're well below 1.2 volts. So that's not good. If we scroll down to our VR VOUT sensor, we can see that our average voltage on VR VOUT is still 1.2 volts. So these are all, like, the average voltage for all of the settings I've shown here is the same, with the exception of Socket Sense Mode 7 LLC, where the average voltage was, like, bouncing around weirdly. But that's why you shouldn't use that one. But anyway, so yeah, mode 5 sucks. Like, your voltage regulation hits, like, there's like 100 millivolts of undershoot at this point. It's just bad. And then there's, of course, mode 1 in VCC Sense, which behaves exactly the same as mode 1 in Socket Sense. It's just a complete disaster. With piles and piles of undershoot and overshoot and just everything. I mean, the overshoot isn't really, again, the overshoot, not really a concern. The undershoot will cause blue screens. If you're running your CPU, like, yeah, if you're trying to absolutely minimize the load voltage for your CPU in something like Y-Cruncher, mode 1 will just completely screw you. Like, you're going to need a ton of extra voltage to maintain stability, like a ton of extra average voltage to maintain stability, because your minimum voltage is going to be really, really low. Also, I guess I should have pointed out that the events that we're seeing on the oscilloscope here are in the microsecond scale, which is why they don't show up in any monitoring software. Right, like right now we're like as we're right now, we're at like 10 milliseconds per division, and all of the undershoot spikes are like basically a pixel. So yeah, anyway, we're gonna pull up hardware info one last time, as well as Y-Cruncher. And I did that too quickly, so hardware info is now gonna take forever to load. There we go. Yeah, and we're just gonna happily scroll down to our VR VOUT sensor, which is at 1.2 volts. Yeah, look, no V droop. It's nice, steady 1.2 volts. Anyway, we're gonna reset our monitoring, 1.25 volts, and then I move the mouse, and oh boy, we're down to 1.1398 on the minimums. Yeah, that's got to be amazing for CPU stability. We're off our VR VOUT voltage by like 60 millivolts, right? So yeah, like this is just bad. Anyway, the other thing I wanted to show is that these spikes that we're looking at are, let's stretch one out to the point that we can, well, actually, let's get a downward spike, right? Like, those are the important ones. So I'm just going to put the trigger down here. Move the mouse. That was nice and easy. Yeah, so this spike right here is, like, here's, like, from here to here is 4 microseconds. This dip is, like, 1 microsecond long. There is no monitoring software that will pick up on that. So, yeah. Anyway, and there's, like, a whole bunch of those dips, right? Also, this one isn't even that low. Probably because I didn't set the trigger that far down. Did I set it too low this time? Where's my trigger at? 1.14. There we go. Now we got one. And yeah, this one is also about, like, a microsecond-ish. It's not even. It's actually even shorter than that, right? From, like, here to here is, like, not even a microsecond. It's a bit shorter than that. So these are very, very, very quick events. But the thing is, if the CPU is trying to, you know, run at, say, 5.5 gigahertz, and for a couple microseconds, it doesn't have the voltage it needs, it's just gonna crash. So that's why, like, the undershoot is what I focus so much on when doing these videos. So, yeah, anyway, hopefully that answers this comment right here. The optimal LLC for the Z690 Unify X with a 13900K is socket sense with mode 6 or mode 5, or if you're going to use VCC sense, it's mode 7. Yeah, and I'll actually probably put my testing notes down in the description, or well, no, yeah, I will. Anyway, that's it for the video. So thank you for watching. Like, share, subscribe, leave any comments, questions, suggestions down in the comment section below. If you'd like to support what I do here with actually hardcore overclocking, I have a Patreon. There's a link to that down in the description below. There's also the HOC Teespring store where you can pick up shirts, hoodies, posters, you know, the usual YouTuber merch. And I've also got a Bandcamp. So yeah, that's it for the video. Thanks for watching, and goodbye.